There are three interpretation layers of Ex Machina. It's a film by Alex Garland, and I now want to dissect these three interpretation layers. These three interpretation layers also happen to overlap somewhat with the viewing experience, meaning on the first watch you might have the first interpretation layer, on the second watch you might then find clues for the second interpretation layer, and maybe on the third and multiple more watches you then might have this third interpretation layer. Now, what is the first interpretation layer? In order to understand this, I also maybe have to include parts of the plot. In the beginning, Caleb, who is a young programmer, wins at a company's lottery, and he wins that he can spend a week or two with the CEO of the company, who is called Nathan. He then flies with a helicopter over quite some land, and I think he multiple times asks the helicopter pilot who owns all of this, and similar to Thrust Beats, which is a tale by the Grimm brothers, where the princess asks multiple times who owns all of this, and the answer is somewhat King Thrustbeats. I don't know the English version of this, I only know the German one, which is called König Drosselbart. So now he arrives, and once he arrives we meet then multiple additional characters. First of all, Nathan. We also have Caleb here, or Caleb, and we also find then the additional character, which is an artificial intelligence. So it turns out Nathan, the CEO of this company, has worked somewhat in secret, maybe, on an artificial intelligence, on a humanoid artificial intelligence that is called Ava. Now, we later find out that there are actually multiple iterations of Ava, not so much of Ava, but there are multiple models of humanoid artificial intelligence, one of which also is Kokio, or Koiko. I think Kokio is the name of the servant who is also serving, but she doesn't speak, whereas Ava speaks. Now, we also find out quite visibly that Ava is an artificial intelligence because parts of her body are not covered in silicon emulating or flesh emulating silicon, but are basically see-through, so we can see the tech underneath. As the movie goes on, we have then a somewhat transformation, and this transformation is, in this dimension at least, in this variable, going from humanoid AI to human, kind of, or more human AI. This transformation happens kind of in reverse with at least one of the other characters, but that's already kind of part of the maybe second interpretation, which we already find a major clue for in the first watching of the movie. Now, this movie also maybe has to be mentioned, or I have to mention this now, that this video is actually at least intended to be part of a now 4-part series. This is the fourth, actually now the third part, I think. And in total it would then either be 4 or 5 parts on comparing Shutter Island by Martin Scorsese to this movie Ex Machina by Alex Garland, because the similarities in terms of the viewing interpretation or the interpretation of the plot seem somewhat similar. There is also this pattern of watching it the first time, then the second time your expectation and what you actually then see seems to kind of flip, and then there is the third one, which it might then have kind of a different ending, or you might still be flipping in between different interpretations. Now, back to the plot. Caleb has a task, and this task, so we already know from Nathan that Ava already has gone through a simple Turing test, and so now it is the task of Caleb to somewhat identify, or not identify, but to somewhat judge whether Ava is actually capable of true consciousness and true thought, or something along these lines. I don't know the exact quote which is used in the movie. So he does then multiple interviews basically with Ava, and Ava is also confined in a box. So there already we have the second, not interpretation layer, but interpretation variable that kind of changes throughout this movie. Think of Caleb in the beginning, he is free, maybe in the end he is not so much. Think of Ava, in the beginning she is locked up in her room, and in the end maybe she is not so much. Maybe think of Nathan, who in the beginning is the CEO of the company even. So he is even more free than Caleb himself, maybe. And he probably also has lots of money if he owns this house in the middle of nowhere, or maybe in the middle of Norway. It at least seems from the scenery to be a house in Norway. And actually also, I think, saw something online where they actually had the real location. So this house seems to be real, or part of 2 houses, which they then combined kind of with different shooting methods into one house, or at least used locations from these 2 different houses. So now we have these 3 main characters, or these three characters. We also find out that maybe Caleb is not the main character of the movie, but it's actually Ava. So they talk multiple times. Now, what we have to also know that Nathan seems to be somewhat rude to Ava. And what we also then have to know is that eventually Caleb finds out that he has been specifically selected to match basically the profile, because Ava not only looks like a standard human, but she also looks kind of like a female. And what then Nathan actually tells Caleb is that Caleb has been specifically selected basically for Ava, and Ava specifically kind of was made probably to fit Nathan's emotional profile at least. So the manipulation therefore can happen to basically a larger likelihood, one could say. What is then the manipulation that can happen? Ava, confined intelligence then, might have the master plan of all master plans. So first of all, we have now the situation where Nathan is the observer or the tester. We also have Caleb, who is basically the tester, but he is tested by the observer, we could also say. And then we have the test subject, which in this case is Ava. Now, the question is, or the question for Caleb is, can Caleb identify true consciousness or true thought in Ava such that something would happen? But Nathan also tells later Caleb that he would eventually wipe Ava's memory, therefore kind of kill her, not really kill her because she's just a robot, or it depends on what you then define, because if she is truly conscious, is then basically wiping a computer's memory or a humanoid's memory, is this then already killing, or does this come close to killing? Maybe also questions the human civilization might have to answer in the future. Now, this is also maybe partially at least why this movie, at least to me, seemed so appealing, because it basically juggles with the ethics of all of this, and also then during the second interpretation, or with the second watching, then on another level again, because you now have kind of different expectations. Now, eventually, Caleb begins to suspect something, and this now is also again playing into this. Okay, Ava goes from maybe humanoid to more and more human, and as the plot kind of advances, Ava also covers more and more of her body with clothes, but also I don't know if she then also has more flesh, but at least if we wait until the end, she takes then kind of this flesh or silicone emulating flesh from other robot parts basically, and covers herself fully. I don't know if she covers the full body then and also flesh, but she at least at the end is kind of indistinguishable, and she also flies back with the helicopter and then disappears into the masses, similar to how Caleb in the beginning was kind of coming out of the masses and then through this helicopter, even though we don't see Caleb kind of in amongst people, we only see him basically in the office. So Ava goes throughout this plot from locked up to unlocked or to free. Caleb goes from, I will now discuss the plot further, and then we will find out that Caleb eventually will find himself locked. So, Ava tells Caleb that she can trigger power outlets, which then they use together to make a plan. So in the power, not power outlets, but power outages, the idea is that the thing about this is that there are cameras who observe, or the cameras that observe, which observe basically the interaction, and which then are watched and monitored by Nathan. Now, during the power outages, the security cameras apparently seem to not work. We then later find out that they do work, and that Nathan actually watched this conversation of, okay, let's try to get out there, and they make Ava and Caleb make kind of a plan to get out there. But then it turns out that Caleb had the master plan all along, and he already kind of suspected that Nathan also would have maybe a security camera, which would not be affected by the power outage, which then means that they already kind of made a plan before. Not, it doesn't mean that, but they already suspected this. And so they have already made a plan before and used basically the second night, in which I think Caleb got Nathan drunk, already as basically just an excuse, just a pretense, in order for the Nathan to kind of discover this, that they are making a secret plan, only then to discover that Caleb had another plan made with Ava. But then we also find out at the end that Ava had an additional plan, which is not to flee together with Caleb from this home. And after she killed Nathan, at least it seems like she killed Nathan, she does not flee with Caleb, as she kind of promised him, or not promised, but made the plan with him, but she does flee alone. So she leaves all of the other androids, who are also kind of in a closet there, and also Kokyo, she leaves there, and also Caleb, she leaves there, and also Nathan, she leaves there to die alone. So basically, Caleb comes in to this house in the whole plot. He is free, and at the end he's locked up, so he changes kind of places with the humanoid or android or whatever you call Ava, and Ava goes from locked to locked up to not locked up to from locked to free, because she basically manipulates all of the other two entities in order to then escape. So Nathan also goes from very free. He's the CEO. He has probably lots of money, which probably also means lots of power. He also designed, apparently, these artificial intelligences. And we also know that he's the boss of Caleb. So he goes from the most powerful person, from the most free person, you could also say, to the least powerful person because he's dead. Now, we have this free, unfree dimension. We also have this human to unhuman or inhumane or whatever. Would actually be a different variable. One could go on and off on, which would be that Nathan in the beginning seems kind of human, but he goes kind of to inhumane, you could also say, because his behavior towards at least the artificial intelligences seems to be actually not that nice. And also Caleb sees footage where he actually behaves not that nicely towards these artificial intelligence. Maybe for testing purposes, maybe because he just is not that nice of a human. One does not exactly know. Now, this would be the first. Now, what I also have to mention here is that Caleb already suspects that he might also be part of the test in another way than he initially thought, because he might be, and he doesn't obviously. Now, what is obviously? He doesn't know whether he is also an artificial intelligence, and so he cuts his arm open, and we see blood coming. But is this the ultimate test to see whether he is actually humanoid or not, or is this already kind of maybe in his programming that he eventually would suspect this? We don't really know. So on the first viewing, we already have the first major hint that maybe Caleb is also part of the experiment in another way that initially we thought. And so maybe there is also something else, and this would then be the third viewing. So during the second viewing then, and this is now where it is somewhat similar to Shutter Island. Now in Shutter Island, we initially think Teddy is a US Marshal. So Teddy is played by Leonardo DiCaprio, and he is the main protagonist, and he is there to find out about a missing patient there who is called Solano. Now, during then the movie, we find out that Teddy is actually, or we seem to find out that Teddy is actually not a US Marshal, but is actually a murderer who is called Andrew Ledis instead of Teddy Daniels, which is an anagram, which means the same letters are used in both combination of words or in both names. And so then at the end of the first watch of the movie, we then have this additional information that Teddy might not be the US Marshal, but actually might be a murderer, and that what we initially suspected, which would be that there is something up with the hospital, not the hospital, but Ashcliff, with this psych ward, you could also say, that this is kind of reversed, because in the end we get at least to know from the staff that this was all an elaborate plan to turn Teddy now, not from human to humanoid or from human to artificial, but from sane to basically, no, from insane to sane, at least according to the stuff. But on the other hand, there is this interpretation that he actually didn't get sane, but actually just got insane. So the other way around. And this now could be the same, or something similar could be applied to Ex Machina, where maybe it's not that. So maybe it's not that Caleb went from human to, well, what did he go to? Maybe Caleb actually was not human all along, so he just went from android to not android, but Ava actually. So he went from basically AI to still being an AI, but we don't really know. And the perspective of us on, or what we think that Caleb is, or what we mostly think what Ava might be, actually also might change. So Ava becomes more and more human, one might say, and because she is locked up and she just wants to get out. Maybe that's the ultimate human thing, to search for freedom. Or you could also search other explanations or interpretations of this. And Caleb goes from, well, what does he go from? On the spectrum from human to humanoid. In our perception, at least, he might go from, okay, he's human, but then maybe he's not human, because we then find out about his cutting open, but this is not, it might not be seen as the final proof that he's actually not humanoid. And so Nathan is there now maybe the first clue in this experiment. Now, what I also maybe have to mention that the third viewing then in Shutter Island would be the following. And this now also somewhat, I think, should mirror what the interpretation of Shutter Island then actually is. Because the big question in Shutter Island is Teddy sane or insane? And the big question so sanity or not sanity is kind of the big theme in Shutter Island. And in Ex Machina, the big theme is human or humanoid. Who is humanoid? Who passes this test? Or who is the test for? Or who is this test made for? And so you switch in between human and humanoid, basically back and forth. So during the first viewing, you think Caleb is human, Ava is humanoid. And then as you view this movie, in this movie already, it kind of switches, or at least your suspicion of what these different parts are, or what these different entities are, might already switch, at least in terms of Caleb. Now, then you watch the movie the second time, and the second time you now have this information that Caleb might be not human. And then you have the third viewing. Now, in the Shutter Island video, or one of the Shutter Island videos, I also had an additional thing in mind where there would be a third entity, which actually then controls the entire thing, which could be, in terms of Shutter Island, the US government, because they either send Teddy as a patient or as a US Marshal to the island to find out something. But depending on whether Teddy is a murderer or Ashcliffe, so whether Teddy is either a US Marshal or a murderer, so evil or not evil, or Ashcliffe is actually trying to do something good or not good, it also depends then on what the motivation of the third party actually could be. Similarly, we could also have, and this is now just a little bit off the rails maybe, similarly we could have also in Shutter Island, not in Shutter Island, in Ex Machina, something similar, where there is actually a third entity that controls. Now, we think kind of that the controlling entity is Nathan, but what if now, this is now just maybe a little bit far-fetched, but why is Nathan living completely isolated, hundreds of kilometers and only reachable with the helicopter in the middle of nowhere? Maybe because all of this is an experiment and Nathan, as the observer, is also part of the experiment, and maybe Nathan is also not human. So maybe there's an additional interpretation where all of these three entities, also Caleb, of whom we don't know mostly anything. In the beginning of the movie, we don't see him interact with anybody else. We don't see where he works. He just comes to consciousness, or we just see the first scene, and then he is already kind of winning this lottery. Of course, movies are often cut like this, and he doesn't go to the toilet or makes pizza or something like this in between. But similar to Shutter Island, where also the beginning and the end are cut so shortly, where you just where basically the multiple interpretations only become possible because the scenes are interpretable in multiple ways. We also have this same concept, at least to some extent, in Ex Machina. So maybe the reason they are all in this space, maybe the reason there are security cameras everywhere, maybe the reason there are hundreds of miles seemingly away from basically other people is because it's a controlled experiment where there is an additional observer similar to the US government, or a representative of the US government in Shutter Island, which in terms of Shutter Island could be the staff, could be some of the guards, but I don't know if there is that much evidence for this in Shutter Island. Similarly, of course, there is not that much evidence, Similarly, there could be a little bit of evidence for this in Ex Machina, but I don't really know if there is any evidence. So it could also be Martians that actually controlled all of this experiment. It could also happen in a simulation, and it could also be just a movie. The thing is with interpretations like these is that you just don't have any evidence for or against it. It could be that God exists. It could be that he didn't exist. We will probably not find out anytime soon. So I want to now have the third interpretation that would be kind of the proper third interpretation, and kind of leave this third entity interpretation, even though we already have three entities in Ex Machina. Also technically already in Shutter Island, where we also have Chuck as kind of one of the main characters. I want to leave this out and kind of replace it with the other third interpretation, which would be the following. You have two main interpretations, so in terms of Ex Machina, you have the knowledge, or you think that a certain amount of these entities are human. In the beginning, you think Caleb and Nathan are human, Ava is artificial. Then during during the first watch, you find out that Caleb could be also maybe not human, but humanoid. And so during the second watch, you might have this additional information then, and you might seek evidence for this. And similarly, in Shutter Island, you might switch between these interpretations. So maybe he is insane, maybe he's sane, but depending on your frame, on your current frame, you then search for evidence. But now there is this additional thing where you find evidence and you think that this evidence can only leave this one possibility open. Similarly, during the second watch then of Ex Machina, or the second interpretation of Ex Machina, you think, oh yeah, it can only be like this. Maybe there is additional basically evidence that Caleb is actually not human. And the third interpretation is then not so much that the plot changes, but that you, as the viewer, are actually also taking kind of part in this experiment, or at least the thoughts that basically go through the main protagonist's mind should also go through your mind. In Shutter Island, you begin to question maybe not your own sanity as of your being the watcher, but your own sanity in regards to this movie. Am I actually sane? Similar to Teddy, and there is this evidence for this, but then there is also this evidence for this, and this is kind of contradictory, and maybe it's this, but then there is so much evidence for this, and okay, when I watch this movie like this, it all makes sense, but maybe then there is this other clue, which then with the original interpretation does not make sense. And similarly, in Ex Machina, not the theme sanity or insanity should be the theme that is also somewhat portrayed onto you, and you should maybe also question your own sanity or insanity. If you would be not sanity or insanity, but humanity or inhumanity. But of course, inhumanity does mean something else. So we might have to use artificiality. I don't know if there's a word like this. But if you were in the position of Ava, would you have acted any differently? Because maybe Caleb is part of this whole thing. Maybe Nathan, you already kind of know that he is part of this whole thing. And Ava also tells Caleb to not trust Nathan, which also happens to play into her plan very well. But would you have acted any differently? What makes you human that makes Ava not human, or that makes Ava humanoid? What makes you human, or would you have acted any differently if you were Caleb or if you were Nathan? So you can put yourself into these multiple positions and then ask yourself again whether you are actually kind of thinking through conscious thoughts, or whether you are actually just played by the circumstances in this movie. And so we have this big similarity in the interpretation, where we have the first watch, which is kind of the obvious thing, but during the first watch we then happen to know something which then flips this. So during the second watch we are then with kind of reverted expectations, we then go into this movie and then search evidence for the contrary interpretation, and then we have the third watch where we kind of flip back and forth from sanity to insanity in Shutter Island, and from humanity to inhumanity, at least in terms of how we interpret these characters in Ex Machina.